There are categories of people for whom married life seems to be something unattainable and unnatural. A promiscuous and disorderly lifestyle can sometimes create so many love triangles that a whole database has to be created for those suspected of a brutal crime. Festus is a small town in the state of Missouri, USA, with a population of about 10,000 residents, which can be called a kind of religious community. Almost all the locals are believers who stand out for their calmness and friendliness. It's a quiet corner where people live family lives, know each other well, and maintain strong ties. However, sometimes it is in such peaceful towns that evil manifests itself in the most terrible and cruel way. On November 21, 2000, an alarming call came into the local sheriff's office. An agitated witness reported that she had heard a shot not far from the factory and noticed a suspicious car. The woman did not dare to come closer to find out what had happened, but she was sure that the person behind the wheel was wounded. Police officers immediately went in the direction of the industrial complex. A few hundred meters from it, in the middle of a field, they found a pickup truck. From a distance, it might seem that the car had some technical problems, because the hazard lights were flashing. But when the patrol officers approached the vehicle, they saw that the windshield was broken. And inside, behind the wheel, a man was sitting motionless. He showed no signs of life, his foot still on the brake. Below lay an unfinished can of soda, which had probably fallen out of the victim's hand after the shot rang out. There was a large through-and-through hole in the deceased's skull. The bullet had passed right through and even managed to break the windshield. The man was either shot point-blank or a very powerful weapon was used. An elderly witness said that the murder had occurred literally minutes before the police arrived, as the bloodstains were still fresh and continuing to flow onto the car floor. Officers called for backup, and in the meantime conducted a preliminary inspection of the scene. They assumed that the driver had been shot from the back seat, as the bullet had pierced the headrest. As it turned out, the car belonged to 39-year-old Larry Holman. It looked like he was the one who had been shot in the car. The victim's face was so disfigured that additional expertise was needed for accurate identification. However, it did not take long, the medical examiner confirmed the investigators' guesses. This case turned out to be quite personal for Detective Randy, who arrived at the crime scene. He had previously worked together with the deceased at his previous job. The hardest part for Randy was calling Larry's loved ones and telling them what had happened. The detective also personally knew Holman's wife, Tammy, who was shocked by this terrible news. The murdered man was survived by sisters, brothers, his beloved wife Tammy, and 2 children, for whom this event was an unbearably painful blow. Randy did not tell Tammy over the phone that Larry was dead. Therefore, at first Tammy thought that her husband was alive, just wounded, and she rushed to the scene. But when she realized that Larry was gone, she fell to the ground, overcome with grief, and began to sob uncontrollably. It seemed that the whole world had collapsed for this woman in an instant. Now she was left a single mother with 2 children, without the loving husband that Larry had been to her. But in fact, this tragic chapter of the story was just beginning. Larry Holman and Tammy Duncan met at church. The girl was much younger than him, but the man fell passionately in love and began to persistently court her. At the time of their meeting, Tammy had just turned 16, and her suitor was 28 years old. By that time, he had already managed to get divorced and had a daughter from his first marriage. The romantic relationship between Larry and Tammy began immediately after she finished school. As close relatives of the couple said, they had a sincere and loving relationship. Larry's colleagues recalled that he even carried a photo of his wife in his lunchbox so that every time he sat down to lunch at work, he could see her image. There were many such touching sentimental moments in the life of this married couple. They got married, had a son, Josh, and a daughter, Natalie, were very religious people and seemed absolutely happy. At least, that was the impression they made on those around them. Larry was considered a do-gooder. Everyone described him as an extremely pleasant person in every way. The man had no bad habits or addictions, was not connected with the criminal world. It was completely incomprehensible who could wish him harm at all. The initial version of the investigation, according to which the criminal was sitting in the back seat of the car and shot the driver, was not confirmed. A detailed analysis of the car and reconstruction of the bullet's trajectory showed that the shot was fired from a fairly long distance, using a powerful ammunition. The bullet entered through the rear side window, then diagonally passed through the headrest and hit Larry in the back of the head. After being wounded in the head, the victim pressed the brake pedal, and the car stopped. The injury turned out to be fatal. The man died without even having time to realize what had happened. This is how the police officers who arrived at the call found him. The detective's first version was an accident, because hunting was allowed in this area, and the incident occurred just at the beginning of the hunting season. Moreover, given the scale of the damage, we were talking about the use of a very high-quality and powerful rifle, which hit the victim from a considerable distance. Such weapons are characteristic of hunters. It was assumed that it could have been an accident. Some clumsy hunter accidentally fired from the forest. However, a more detailed analysis showed that the shot was not fired from the forest, but from the opposite side. There were reasonable doubts as to whether the car was moving at the moment the bullet hit. Of course, there was a brake track on the road, but it was impossible to determine exactly whether Larry stopped before or after the shot. Moreover, as the police officers who were the first to arrive at the scene noted, the car's headlights were turned off. And this indicated that at the time the driver was wounded, the car was unlikely to be in motion. The wife confirmed that her husband could have left the car near the factory. So everything pointed more to an ambush than to an accident. In any case, it was unlikely that the wounded driver would waste his strength turning off the headlights. It seemed that he had stopped, and only then was he deliberately shot. Thus, the version of intentional murder appeared, but most of the law enforcement officers involved in the investigation did not really believe in it. The exception was only Detective Randy, who personally knew the deceased. It seemed that no one but him showed any particular enthusiasm in investigating this case. The investigator himself was convinced that his friend had become the victim of a carefully planned attack. Others did not want to believe it, because the area was considered very safe, and such cases had not happened here before. Over the past decade, there had not been a single murder in this area. People simply could not believe that someone could raise a hand against such a positive and friendly person as Larry Holman. However, despite this, Detective Randy intuitively felt that it was intentional murder, not an accident. He knew the deceased well and was sure that he could not have become an accidental victim. Larry was a very bright and good-natured person. It seemed incredible that he could have enemies capable of such a brutal murder. But despite this, the experienced investigator clearly understood that someone had deliberately deprived Holman of his life. It is unlikely that the wounded driver would have wasted his strength turning off the headlights. He had obviously stopped, and only then was he deliberately shot. This circumstance prompted the detectives to think about intentional murder. However, this version was not supported by most law enforcement officers involved in the investigation. The exception was only Randy, who personally knew the deceased. It seemed that no one but him showed any particular enthusiasm in finding the truth. The investigator was firmly convinced that his friend had become the victim of a carefully planned attack. Others did not really believe it, because the area was considered very safe, and such incidents had not happened here before. Over the past decade, there had not been a single murder in this area. People simply could not believe that someone could take the life of such a bright and friendly person as Larry Holman. However, this death did not seem accidental to Detective Randy, despite the incredible nature of the situation. The investigator knew Larry well and was sure that he could not have had enemies capable of such a brutal murder. Against this background, the version of a tragic accident might have looked plausible. But despite common sense, Randy felt that someone had deliberately deprived Holman of his life. In order to shed light on this complicated case, the investigator began to question everyone who was acquainted with the family of the deceased. The first people he turned to, of course, were Larry's relatives and neighbors. The man who lived in the house across the street was a close friend of Holman. He said that shortly before the murder, he had seen Larry at church. When they both came to the Sunday service with their families, the neighbor heard from his friend about some problems. Larry said that he was quitting his job, and even asked if there might be a place for him in his friend's company. The man noticed that Holman looked tense, but to all questions he only waved it off and changed the subject. The same neighbor provided the police with another piece of interesting information. It turned out that he often went hunting with Larry. The men never missed a season and went to the forest again a couple of days after meeting at church. At some point, the friends split up. And soon Larry reported over the radio that he had been shot at. Holman gave his location, and the neighbor rushed to help. As the man was walking to the agreed point to pick up Larry from the forest, he noticed a stranger in camouflage walking towards him, but in the opposite direction. According to Missouri law, a hunter who hunts with a firearm is required to wear such clothing. So the appearance of a person in such an outfit did not arouse any suspicion. When he reached Holman, the neighbor saw that he was whole and unharmed. According to Larry, the bullet had whistled literally centimeters from his head, but miraculously did not touch him. His friend suggested that the shooter was some novice hunter who was not very skilled with weapons. Holman himself admitted that he had not noticed anyone in the forest, so he was probably hit by accident. At that time, the incident did not seem particularly strange. Every year, you can meet hundreds of people in the hunting grounds, and from time to time there are unfortunate cases when one hunter mistakes another for game and unintentionally injures or even fatally wounds them. However, not that many people hunted in this area. Therefore, such an incident might have seemed somewhat strange, especially given that Larry was eventually shot after all. And now Detective Randy finally became convinced that this was definitely not an accident. Unfortunately, Holman's friend could not describe the oncoming hunter in detail, whom he had seen in the forest only in passing and had not paid attention to his appearance. Meanwhile, investigators continued to thoroughly examine the area around Larry's discovered car, hoping to find the place where the fire had come from. Most of the area was covered with dense thickets. However, the trajectory of the bullet indicated that the shooter was somewhat apart from the forest, near the railroad track. It was here that a woman named Helen lived, the same one who reported the suspicious car to the police. The detectives visited her to find out if she had noticed anything strange on the day of the murder. According to Helen, some time after her call to the police, a car parked not far from the house. A man in camouflage got out of it, took a large hunting rifle out of the trunk, and headed towards the forest. However, he never actually crossed into the thicket itself. The woman admitted that this situation seemed unusual to her. After all, hunters usually go straight into the depths of the forest, and not loiter near houses. However, Helen did not see what happened next, so the further development of events remained behind the scenes for her. At the same time, investigators were studying the victim's biography, trying to find at least some leads that would lead to the trail of the probable killer. But Larry Holman turned out to be crystal clear. A calm family man, with no criminal past, a hunter and fisherman, the father of 2 children, a decent husband and a reliable worker. However, shortly before his death, he decided to quit the company where he had worked for many years, and that's why he was wondering if he could become an assistant worker for his neighbor. Everyone who knew Larry described him as a very good person who was hard to imagine being involved in anything illegal. The town of Festus was a small, close-knit community where everyone was in plain sight of everyone else. And it was this circumstance that was most alarming. Whoever was behind Holman's murder, his motives remained a mystery. The town began to fear that the criminal might turn out to be a maniac, for whom Larry was only the first victim. The public began to put pressure on law enforcement, demanding that the perpetrators be found and punished as soon as possible. Terrible rumors spread through the town, which usually only hinder the investigation, distracting from the real picture of events. However, this time the amount of evidence that cast doubt on the reputation of Larry's widow was steadily growing. The locals believed that Tammy was too young for Larry. There were rumors that she remained a flighty and insatiable woman who, hiding from her husband, wore revealing clothes and often visited nightclubs and bars. Many people noticed that during Larry's night work shifts, unfamiliar cars appeared near Tammy's house. For a long time, no one attached any special importance to this. After all, on the outside, Tammy gave the impression of a decent wife who spent a lot of time with her children. So everyone assumed that it was just friends or relatives coming to visit. However, after rumors that these meetings might not have been friendly at all, but that Tammy was actually regularly cheating on her husband with lovers, the situation changed. Now the whole company of young men who visited the Holman's house in the absence of the owner turned into potential suspects. After all, if the widow really led a dissolute life behind Larry's back, each of these men could have had a motive for eliminating him. One of the neighbors shared valuable information with the detectives. According to her, a few days after Larry's death, her children were playing with Tammy's children. When the woman came to pick them up to go home, she saw an unfamiliar man in the Holman's house who behaved surprisingly confidently, as if he were the master here. The witness was surprised by such behavior of a stranger, especially given that Larry had died quite recently under extremely suspicious circumstances. To all the neighbors' questions, Tammy replied that he was just her old classmate who decided to support his friend in a difficult hour. This information interested the investigators, and they quickly identified the mysterious guest. He turned out to be Tim Smith, who was described as a peculiar young man with a difficult character. The police found out that he had moved in with Tammy the very next day after she became a widow. Tim immediately took Larry's place and began to use his things absolutely freely. The deceased's children clearly did not like this situation. They were dissatisfied that a stranger was now in charge of their home. But Tammy seemed indifferent to her own children's feelings. It seemed that she had lost her head from love for Tim. The detectives decided to check if Smith had a criminal past. After all, it was quite possible that he had a motive for committing this brutal crime. However, contrary to expectations, law enforcement officers did not find anything suspicious. The most serious violation of the law in Tim's biography was only a few fines for non-compliance with traffic rules. However, it was found out that Tammy and Tim had indeed studied together in high school. They even dated for a while, but after graduation their paths diverged. Despite this, the investigators were alarmed by Tim's rapid transformation from an old acquaintance into the actual cohabitant of the widow. To shed light on the situation, the cops invited Smith to the police station for a conversation. They hoped that he would be able to tell them something important for the investigation. During the interrogation, the suspect behaved surprisingly arrogantly. He denied his involvement in Larry's death, but admitted that he had indeed moved in with Tammy immediately after her husband's death. Prior to that, he allegedly just visited her often and stayed overnight several times. Moreover, at the time of the interrogation, Tim was already openly calling himself Tammy's partner. He also confirmed that he had been Tammy's lover for a long time. According to him, Holman had never been particularly faithful to her husband and constantly had affairs on the side. Recently, she had allegedly been going to file for divorce in order to marry Tim in the future. This information led the detectives to think that it was the desire to get rid of Larry and tie her life to Smith that could have been Tammy's motive for murder. After all, why resort to a bloody massacre if she could have just gotten a peaceful divorce and built a new relationship? Anyway, now the couple in love had turned into the main suspects in this complicated case. Later, witnesses were found who confirmed that after the sudden widowhood, Tammy behaved more than strangely. Even at her own husband's funeral, she appeared in excessively revealing clothes for such a sad event. It seemed that the woman was not at all concerned about the mourning of those present. Tammy smiled all the time and openly flirted with other men. From time to time, she left the procession and suspiciously talked to someone on the phone for a long time. One of the sisters of the deceased Larry accidentally overheard how during these conversations Holman called male names. So rumors began to spread that, in addition to Tim Smith, Tammy had at least one more lover. One of the witnesses mentioned the name of Tom Rumbell in this context. The woman said that she had repeatedly seen him driving past the Holman's house while Larry was at work. At these moments, Tammy was usually sunbathing in front of the house in a rather revealing bikini. Tom allegedly stopped to greet her and pay a compliment. In passing, the neighbor hinted that a short-lived romance could have developed between them. However, as it turned out later, Rumbell was much younger than Tammy. So their love affair was fleeting and did not develop into anything serious. But this list of Holman's probable lovers did not end there. While talking to witnesses, the name of another man was mentioned again and again, Charlie Miller. Larry's older daughter from his first marriage said that she first heard about him when she was working as a cashier in a grocery store near the house. Once, her acquaintance came into the store and mentioned in passing that Tammy regularly meets with a neighbor named Charlie Miller. Allegedly, every day, after taking the children to school, she immediately goes to the park, where she spends long hours with him. There were also other young people who confirmed that they had repeatedly heard from Charlie himself about his relationship with Tammy Holman and his status as her lover. As it was possible to find out, Miller met Tammy during the period when he was hired by Larry to do repair work in their house. Charlie was married at the time, but despite this, he became so close to the owner that he began to be considered his friend. It would seem that Charlie's acquaintance with Tammy did not portend anything unusual. Miller was a married man and was doing repair work in the Holman's house for hire. Larry became so close to him that he began to consider him his friend. However, when Charlie first saw the owner's wife, he immediately noticed her playful behavior and propensity for flirting. These flirtations quickly grew into something more, and now the lovers were sharing a bed as soon as Larry went hunting. Soon after, Tammy confessed her infidelity to her husband. Larry himself had already suspected his wife of infidelity for some time, because he saw how Charlie looked at her with interest. Despite this, the Holmans did not get divorced, but decided to try to save the marriage. Larry openly asked Miller to leave his wife alone, to stop all courtship and gifts. But it is unknown whether he listened to his friend's request. Meanwhile, the circle of suspects in the murder was steadily expanding. Investigators found themselves in a difficult situation, because an excessive number of probable killers only complicated the investigation. In order to shed light on the personal life of the deceased, detectives requested data from his widow's cell phone. Even if Tammy did not shoot her husband with her own hands, she could well have been the customer of this brutal crime. After all, it was Holman who brought all these outside men into the family, each of whom had a real motive for reprisal against Larry. The police managed to find correspondence with 3 lovers at once in Tammy's phone: Tom Rumbell, Tim Smith, and Charlie Miller. To sort out this love polygon, the cops decided to talk to the widow herself. In a conversation with law enforcement, the woman admitted that shortly before Larry's death, Tom Rumbell allegedly began to stalk her. To confirm her words, Tammy even provided printouts of messages he had sent her via messenger. According to Holman, she perceived Rumbell as an extremely dangerous person who only caused her fear and anxiety. The man allegedly wrote that they could be happy together, talked about his feelings and desire to get married and have children. Tammy claimed that she tried in every possible way to keep Tom at a distance, was frightened by his persistence and confused by the frankness of his confessions. She even suggested that Rumbell could have been involved in Larry's murder. As a sign of cooperation with the investigation, Holman voluntarily handed over all the printouts of her correspondence with Tom to the police. According to the widow, the harassment by Rumbell did not stop even after the death of her husband and the resumption of relations with Tim Smith. The woman said that she simply did not know how to get rid of the intrusive suitor. Shortly after the interrogation, Tammy even had to go to court for a restraining order against Tom. Interestingly, during a meeting with the police, Rumbell himself readily admitted that he had feelings for Holman. At the same time, he called her appeal to the court a clear exaggeration. The man assured that he did not threaten Tammy at all, and that day he just wanted to give her a bouquet of flowers, not frighten her. However, Tom's behavior still seemed suspicious to the cops. In particular, they managed to find out that Rumbell had repeatedly been inside the Holman's house, because he knew all the details of its layout. This circumstance indirectly refuted the widow's words about unwanted harassment by Tom. It seems that in reality he visited Tammy during the periods when Larry was not at home. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed the autopsy of the body and reported that Holman was shot with a large-caliber firearm. According to their conclusion, a .243 caliber hunting rifle designed for deer hunting was used. The bullet also fit this caliber. It was quite heavy and powerful. Continuing to collect and analyze information, investigators repeatedly came across the name of Charlie Miller. It was even possible to establish that shortly before the murder, during the period of renovation of the Holman's house, Charlie and Larry discussed the topic of hunting. At the same time, Miller showed his friend his .243 caliber rifle. Looking at this weapon, Larry could not even imagine that he would soon be shot with it. Wanting to stir up the public, the police made public all the available information in the case, including information about the caliber of the weapon used to kill Holman. After that, the name of Charlie Miller surfaced again. Someone from the locals called the police station and said that Tammy's lover owned a hunting gun of exactly .243 caliber. The cops immediately seized Miller's weapon and sent it for ballistic examination. Fortunately, the investigators already had physical evidence for comparison. After all, near the car of the murdered man, a deformed bullet was found, which was the cause of Larry's death. After the mentioned projectile pierced the victim's head and smashed the windshield, it flew back several dozen meters before falling to the ground. With each new testimony, an unattractive picture of the personal life of the Holman couple became clearer. Instead of a banal love triangle, the outlines of a whole network of Tammy's relationships with other men behind her legal husband's back began to show through. And for each of them, Larry's death could have been a desirable denouement. Investigators knew that Charlie Miller had long maintained a friendly relationship with Holman. At least until he started sleeping with his wife. As soon as the secret became apparent, it inevitably had to provoke a conflict between the former friends. Perhaps it was this dispute that eventually resulted in bloodshed. And the police also managed to find out that after Larry's death, Charlie did not stop communicating closely with Tammy. However, unlike Tim Smith, who immediately took the place of the owner in the Holman house, Miller chose a different approach. He simply gave the widow money and bought various things for her, hoping to receive the desired reward sooner or later. But let's get back to the investigation. Through the intricacies of numerous adulteries, detectives were gradually making their way to the truth. And the first on their list of priorities was Charlie Miller. It turned out that he was driving a car that matched the description of the car noticed near the railroad track not far from the murder scene. The witness got a good look at the driver, but did not communicate with him personally. When this woman was shown a photo of Miller, she identified him without a shadow of a doubt. Almost simultaneously, the results of the ballistic examination arrived, which finally confirmed that Larry had been shot with Charlie's rifle. With all this evidence, on January 9, 2001, law enforcement officers arrived at Miller's house with an arrest warrant. After politely reading him his rights, the police asked to take the suspect to the station to talk about his possible involvement in the murder of his friend. After listening to the standard formalities such as the right to remain silent, Charlie stared at the officer's face. And then unexpectedly, simply and calmly, he admitted his guilt, saying, "I killed him." After Charlie Miller's confession to the murder of Larry Holman, he was arrested and taken to the police station. As for Tim Smith and Tom Rumbell, these two were finally excluded from the list of suspects. They were not involved in the reprisal against Holman. Soon Miller agreed to personally show the cops exactly how he killed his former friend. The man actually came to the house near the railway track, where he was seen by one of the witnesses. It was from there that Charlie took his rifle and went into the field. That day, Miller was dressed in camouflage. He moved along the track, repeating in detail the same route that he had already taken in the morning on the day of the murder. According to him, he had to cross rough terrain for almost a kilometer. But the investigators were most disturbed by the main thing: how could Charlie have known where and at what time Larry would be? Miller answered this question without hesitation. It turns out that it was Tammy herself who instigated him to kill her husband, complaining about the brutal treatment by her tyrant husband. And Charlie, in his imagination, saw himself in the role of a night rescuer. And Miller also said that the attempt on Holman's life on the day of the murder was not the first. Remember the story of Larry's matchmaker about the bullet that whistled a centimeter from Holman's head during a forest hunt? So, it was none other than Charlie who shot him then. It was not a tragic accident. Tammy precisely indicated to her lover where exactly her husband would be walking in the forest. So it was not difficult for Miller to track down the prey. However, after the first failed attempt, Tammy stopped communicating with Charlie for a while. He had to persistently persuade the woman to continue the relationship. In the end, she agreed and again began to incite her lover to murder. Holman was sure that this time the criminal plan would not misfire. Tammy pressured Miller, using a future marriage as an argument. And although Charlie considered Larry his friend, he still decided to commit this terrible crime. All this led to a logical question: why didn't Tammy just file for divorce if the marriage was bringing her only suffering? The answer, as always, was painfully simple: the woman did not want to share property and custody of the children with Larry. More than anything, she wanted to get a large insurance payment in the event of her husband's death. Shortly before his death, he had taken out $1 million policy. Tammy was unlikely to want to let such an amount slip through her fingers. Only the policy turned out to be not an insurance policy, but one that protects against losses caused by an employee. So in the end, the widow managed to get not $1 million, but only $150,000. The police, of course, did not bypass Tammy with an interrogation. She continued to deny her involvement in the murder. According to Holman, she had nothing to do with her husband's death at all. The woman tried to completely shift the responsibility onto Charlie. She allegedly developed an excessive attachment to her through a short-lived affair. Allegedly, Miller constantly demanded more than just an affair. Charlie allegedly began to perceive Larry as the only obstacle on the way to their mutual happiness, so he decided to get rid of his rival. According to Tammy's version, she knew about Miller's gloomy thoughts, but until the last moment she did not believe that he would really dare to commit murder. At the end of the interrogation, Holman let slip that sometimes she feels guilty for her husband's death and all these extramarital affairs. The prosecutor only needed this. He immediately latched onto the last phrase, regarding it as a confession. For his part, Charlie claimed that Tammy personally discussed the plan of action with him. Allegedly, after Larry's death, she was supposed to receive a considerable inheritance, marry Miller and enjoy a prosperous life. But when Holman met another man, Charlie was extremely disappointed in his beloved. Moreover, according to Tammy, the offended Miller began to pursue and intimidate her. The woman admitted that she never intended to marry Charlie, and all his hopes for a joint future were in vain. However, it seemed unlikely to the cops that Miller would suddenly go for the cold-blooded murder of a friend. Surely he had a good motive. First, there was a trial for Charlie. Given the irrefutable evidence and the defendant's personal confession, this process became more of a formality. 40-year-old Miller publicly admitted his guilt in premeditated murder. The only thing he referred to as a mitigating circumstance was a temporary emotional disorder in taking medications that allegedly clouded his ability to make rational decisions. In the end, Charlie made a deal with the investigation and received 25 years in prison. He will not be able to be released until 2026. But the trial of Tammy was much more complicated and confusing. The woman continued to deny any involvement in the crime. And in the courtroom, her lawyer insisted on this same version. But he could not confirm the words of his client with anything. On the other hand, the prosecutors had a lot of trumps, in particular, numerous telephone conversations and correspondence between Tammy and Charlie. They eloquently testified that Miller did not belong to the category of dangerous stalkers, as Holman tried to portray him. Of course, this lie did not benefit Tammy. The jury had less and less doubt that a cunning and hypocritical person who at the same time turned the heads of several men at once had ended up in the dock. Evidence not in Tammy's favor was also indirect evidence. For example, the prosecution placed special emphasis on the numerous phone calls between Holman and Miller on the day of the murder. Obviously, the lovers were discussing the details of the contract crime. And in court, Charlie testified directly implicating Tammy as the instigator of the reprisal against her husband. Despite this, the chances of the prosecution for an unequivocal victory were still in doubt. In order not to take risks, the prosecution resorted to a trick and offered Holman to conclude a plea agreement known as the Alford Doctrine. Its essence is that, without confessing to the crime as such, the defendant at the same time admits, there is quite enough evidence against him for the jury to lean towards a guilty verdict. As a result, 35-year-old Tammy received 7 years in prison. True, the woman never admitted her guilt, insisting that she only went for the deal out of necessity. In 2009, after serving her sentence, Holman returned home to Festus. She hoped that she would be able to restore relations with her children and start life from scratch. But it was not to be. Growing up, Larry Holman's son and daughter still puzzle over the same question. Why, if the marriage became unbearable, did the mother not just divorce the father? Instead, through her actions, she doomed the children to an orphan's life, without a father and without a mother. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.